the Congressional Budget Office did a study in February, and the Congressional Budget Office is neutral. It's not Republican, it's not Trumper,
Right.
it's not MAGA, it's not Democrats. They said in the next 10 years, those people who came into the United States over the last 3 or 4 years would do two things. Number one, they would increase the GDP by $9 trillion, not million, not billion, $9 trillion, and they would reduce the deficit by almost $1 trillion because it's economic activity.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Tell Me Más podcast. My name is Victor Cornejo, and today I am excited about this topic. We are going to dive into an issue that very well may have swung the election this year. It's an important topic. Goes to the very root of who we are as Americans. It speaks to what our values are, and the fact is that we don't know where we are going in the next few months in terms of the issue of immigration, both legal and illegal. And today I have two amazing guests that I can't wait to speak to about this, to really give us a lot more education on this topic because it's being spoken about so much. And I, like most, am just a layman. I'm just a regular guy, and I'm trying to do my research and learn about the system and what the issues really are and what can and cannot be done about it. But it, as much as I love social media, as much as I love the internet, there is so many misconceptions. There is so much out there that is spoken about from an opinion, a purely emotional and opinionated standpoint. But I want to dig a little deeper into the issue. To do that, I have, again, two amazing guests. My first is a dear friend and previous guest on the show and friend of the show, Tony Hernández. He is the founder of the Immigrant Archive Project. And quite honestly, he is the foremost documentarian on the stories of immigrants in the United States of all nationalities. And I encourage everyone to please visit the Immigrant Archive Project and view that work that really captures those stories. And now I have the honor of introducing Ira Kurzban. He is a JD and MA from the University of California, Berkeley, as well as an honorary fellow at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law. He is the recipient of the Wasserstein Fellowship at Harvard University Law School, founding partner of the law firm Kurzban, Tetzley, and Pratt of Miami. And for over 40 years, he has been the head of the firm's immigration department. Beyond that, he is also the guy who wrote the book on immigration law. So quite honestly, the guy who wrote it, it's called the Kurzban's Immigration Law Source Book. It was first published in 1990 and is now in its 19th edition. What's super crazy is the fact that this is the book that immigration judges, DHS personnel, as well as lawyers, law students all go to when it comes to immigration law. And in addition to that, he is the founder of the Immigrants List PAC and Immigrants List Civic Action Incorporated. The PAC is one of the first pro-immigration PACs in the United States, and he essentially is the authority on immigration law. So to the both of you, thank you so much for taking the time to teach me about what I hope to learn.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Great. Ira, so before we get into the nitty gritty, because I definitely want to pick your brain and get down to the dirty details of the law and speak about this from a perspective of absolute expertise. But before that, I do want to ask, what drove you? Why are you so focused on immigration? Why did you focus your entire legal career, a lifetime, on this particular issue?
Well, my father left his country when he was 12 years old on his own from Romania.
Okay.
Worked in a button factory at the age of 12. Then eventually went to Montreal and eventually came to the U.S. and worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yards during the Second World War. to help our country. He was devoted to the United States. He had a 5th grade education. He raised 4 boys. One was a doctor, 2 were lawyers, and 1 was an engineer. I mean, that's the American story. That is really, what immigration is all about and what immigrants contribute to America, something totally forgotten in all the discussions about the border and so forth. But immigrants are America. Immigrants have made America great. I mean, we're all immigrants from one place or another if we go back far enough, but many are immigrants just this generation or the second generation. Look at what the Irish did in Boston, the Italians did in Philadelphia, the Jews did in New York, and the Germans and Scandinavians did in the Midwest, and the Cubans did in Miami. I always say that the quintessential example of the best of the immigration is what the United States did with respect to Cubans who came from the 1950s even up to the present, which is they gave them benefits. They told them they can become residents after a year and a day. And they turned Miami into a backwater community, into the gateway to Latin America. And that is the quintessential idea of what we should be doing with immigrants instead of denigrating them as the next president has repeatedly.
Tony, you recently posted about a very special anniversary in your family's history.
I did indeed. We just recently celebrated our 57th anniversary, if I'm not mistaken, of our arrival to the U.S. just literally just a few days ago. And I'm so glad that Ira cited the example of Cuban Americans as really the template, I think, which should be applied across the country. When I see the opportunities that we were given, when I see how warmly we were received by the U.S. and juxtapose that against the realities for so many others, I can only imagine how much more successful we would be as a nation, right? If so many other groups were allowed to fulfill their full potential the way we were. And perhaps at some point in this conversation, we can turn to my friend Ira here, who, as you very eloquently stated, is the authority. If maybe he can shed a little light on that, I believe it was the 1965 Immigration Act that Lyndon Johnson signed into law, and how that really sort of catapulted the country forward in terms of immigration. And it just really, I find it incredibly disheartening to see that 50 plus years after our arrival, almost 60 years since our arrival, and I see that we're taking some very concerning steps backwards, unfortunately, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely would love to get into that in more detail. To my earlier point, Ira, I think there's a lot of talk and there is a lot of opinion, and I would really love it if you could potentially give us kind of a brief overview of how the actual immigration system works. So we're starting from a base of where we are.
Okay, I teach it in a 13-week course, but I'll try to compress it.
You got 5 minutes.
5 minutes if I can. The way to look at immigration is, first of all, we have a system of immigrants and non-immigrants. Immigrants are people who come to the United States with the idea of staying here permanently. Non-immigrants come temporarily. For example, non-immigrants are H-2A workers who work in the fields and do agricultural work. H-2B workers do temporary work. And I'll point out that the next president, despite his rhetoric about immigration, authorized the 30,000 additional H-2B workers. Those are people who work at places like Mar-a-Lago and other places where they do temporary work in the United States. So we have temporary workers coming in, and some of those workers are investors too. I mean, we have an e-visa, for example, that has to do with investing in the United States and creating jobs for American citizens. Then we have permanent immigration. And in that permanent immigration system, we have a family-based part and an employment-based part. And, the old saw that you often hear as well, people shouldn't come in illegally, they should wait, to be in line and do it the right way, like my grandparents did and so forth. And when their grandparents did it, it probably made sense. But we have not issued additional visas above the current cap for over almost 35 years now, despite, the boom in population, despite the need for other workers. So just to give you two examples, if I'm a Mexican person who is a U.S. citizen and I want to bring my brother or sister to the United States, the waiting time right now, because we don't have enough visas, is 25 years. If I am, and we also have quotas in each country. So for example, with India, if I am a high tech worker and I've come and worked for Amazon on a temporary visa, if I want to be a resident, the waiting time right now from India is 15 years to become a resident of the United States. So
Wow.
this idea that people can just wait online and come in, if I'm a resident and I want to bring in my son or daughter, adult son or daughter, the waiting time right now is about 6 to 8 years. If I'm an American citizen and I want to bring in my married son and daughter, the waiting time is 8 years. So it's not like, somebody can just file a petition and come in. So that's one part of the system. The second part of the system is what we call the difference between deportation and admissibility into the United States. And that's what the fight has generally been over in the discussion. That is, people who are at the border who wish to come in. We have in our system over 30 grounds of inadmissibility. You can't come in if you're a terrorist. You can't come in if the Secretary of State determines it's against the interests of the United States. You can't come in if you've committed crimes and so forth. Those are people who are seeking to enter the U.S. There are also people, by the way, who seek to become a resident through a family member. In other words, I marry someone and it turns out that my fiance had committed crimes outside of the United States. She would never get her green card. She would be inadmissible unless there was a waiver for it. If she ever made a misrepresentation to immigration or to the Department of State to come here, she would be permanently ineligible to become a resident of the United States. So the idea that people can just come in easily is just not so. And those are people at the border. Then there are people who are in the U.S. They are either in the U.S. because they snuck in, or they're in the U.S. Illegally because they overstayed the visa that they were given. Those people are subject to deportation. They may be subject to deportation because they just overstayed their time here. They may be subject to deportation because they committed crimes. They may be subject to deportation because they engaged in some kind of fraud or whatever. But there's a whole series of grounds of deportation. They may be a student who had to drop out of school and therefore was no longer in status. They're subject to deportation from the U.S. So the idea that everybody who is subject to deportation is a criminal clearly is not true. They represent a very, very, very small number. And just to give you some statistics, Victor, in the United States, right now, the undocumented immigrants are 33% less likely to be incarcerated for a crime. Immigrant communities, even the state of Texas, who made a big deal about getting rid of all these immigrants, they did their own study and determined that immigrant communities are 47% less likely to commit crimes. Why? Just makes common sense. They know if they commit a crime, they're going to be put in jail and then they're going to be deported. So the crime rates in immigrant communities are very low. Most of the people we're talking about who are in the U.S. are people who came here legally on a visa and overstayed. And my problem is I go back so long in this process that before 1996, we would be able to make those people a resident. The only penalty was they would have to leave the United States to get their green card and come back.
Right,
Congress in
right.
96 passed a special law called the 3 and 10-year bar. It's a little technical, but not really that much. It means if you overstay by a year and you leave, you can't come back for 10 years. So I can tell you before 1996, I used to get calls from senators. I used to get calls from federal judges saying, I have this woman in my house who's taking care of my elderly parent. I want to do the right thing by her. I want to make her a resident. And you could. You could go through the process. It's called a labor certification. And at the end of it, she would leave the United States, get her green card, and come back. You can't do that anymore because of the special 3 and 10-year bar. And the reason why it's a problem is that that's why we have all these undocumented people. In other words, Congress actually created the problem that we have today by passing this special law. We through Immigrants List have been trying to get rid of this because when they keep talking about all these undocumented people, they're mostly hardworking people who otherwise would have become residents years ago under the old system, but because they passed this special law, can't become residents. So when faced with the prospect of going home for 10 years, they stay here. So that's the situation with respect to why we have, this large undocumented, or when they say undocumented, they're really people, for the most part, who came with visas and just stayed, have been working here, have families here, and so forth. Many of them, which is one other point about the immigration system I want to make, which people don't realize, is these are not just individual entities. They have families. Their families are American citizens. Their children are American citizens. So you're tearing them away from their family because they overstayed their time in the US and can't become a resident. You're destroying not just their lives, you're destroying American citizens' lives, which I think is often lost in the discussion. And one final point, which is about the border. The idea that the next president has created that where we have an invasion at the border just doesn't match with the numbers over the years that we've had. And I just want to give you some of those numbers. In the year 2000, under a Republican administration, we had 1.6 million people coming to the United States. In 2001, we had 1.2 million.
I'm sorry, when you say come to the United States, that means they came to the border or flew in and they immigrated and stayed in the United States?
No, I'm sorry. It means that they were apprehended at the border. So when we talk
Okay.
about this mass influx,
Right.
we're talking about people who were apprehended by immigration. So in the year 2000, it was 1.6 million. In the year 2001, it was 1.2 million. In Donald Trump's last year prior to COVID, it was 859,000 people. The numbers went up after COVID. In 2021 to 1.6 million, and in 2022 to 2.2, 2023 to 2 million, and then in 2024 back down to 1.5 million. So the idea of this mass influx that all of a sudden happened in America has never been true. It's ebbed and flowed depending on the economic situations and so forth, but we've generally had somewhere between, I would say, 700,000 and 1.2 million people always coming to the border and being apprehended.
Now,
So,
okay, so
yeah.
and I'm sorry because I think it's definitely necessary to kind of dig into that. So when you say apprehended, does that mean they came to the border crossing to the port? Let's say they were apprehended and sent back and the reason I understand this is because it is often cited that Obama was in fact the deporter in chief, right? He sent in his 2 terms 3 million were deported during Trump's first term, 1.4 million were deported, and President Biden, his administration, is on pace to actually deport slightly more than those in Trump's first
Correct.
term. So apprehension sounds to me like you're there, you get sent back, versus deportations. You were already let in. We figure out that you're illegal and we send you back. That's two different sort of worlds. Am I right?
Right. And I'm glad you asked that question because that leads to the final point. Besides this immigration system I've described, we've had a system where if people seek asylum in the United States, we can't just kick them out. In other words, we signed an international treaty that came out of World War II called the Convention on Refugees. And we signed the protocol in 1967 of that convention. And that convention basically says we will not return people to a country where their life or freedom would be threatened. And why? Because during the Second World War, as I think many of your listeners probably know, we had this horrible history of people going to other countries, fleeing Nazi Germany, going to Switzerland, and being turned back at the border, getting on a ship and coming first to Cuba, the famous St. Louis example, where they went to Cuba, then they went to the United States, and they were sent back to Nazi Germany to die in concentration camps. So the idea was coming out of World War II that we said, the countries of the world said, we will not send back a person whose life or freedom would be threatened. And we incorporated that into our own law. And then we incorporated into our own law the Convention Against Torture that says no matter who the person is, we're not sending somebody back to a country where we know they will be tortured.
Now,
So some of those people coming to the border, if they express a fear of return, they're entitled to some kind of hearing. And the fight has always been over what that hearing really is and how much of a hearing you give people. But this notion of just totally closing the border and not even allowing people to have a claim heard is not only clearly violative of our law and violative of international law, it's kind of morally reprehensible if the person is going to die or be tortured if they go back to their country. So that's where that whole
right.
fight comes in.
Now, so I keep hearing, and I knew that this asylum thing is far larger than just, what we're dealing with here, but it had to do with international law and treaties. Now, there is this thought that the claim of asylum is abused, that you can't claim asylum if really all you're looking to do is to come here and improve your economic state. Is that correct?
I think that's absolutely right. There are people who abuse the system, but let's say you're president of the United States or you're the head of the Department of Homeland Security. You have to devise a system that says the people who are being truly in danger versus the people who are abusing the system. How do we make that determination? How do we who decides it? Does an immigration judge decide it? Does an immigration officer at the border decide it? How do we do it? How do we do it as quickly as possible, given the large numbers of people coming? But the real way to deal with all of this is many of those people who are coming, who are doing it just to abuse the system, are coming through smugglers. And so what we should be doing is dedicating our resources to going after the smugglers, number one, and going after the root causes of why people are coming here. And, the government of Mexico sued the gun manufacturers of the United States, saying, you're not allowed to have a handgun in Mexico. You can't just get a gun. And they're flooding the Northern Triangle countries with weapons. They're flooding Mexico with weapons, the gun manufacturers in the US. If you want to look for a bad guy in this whole scenario, really, it's the gun manufacturers who've created the conditions of destabilization in the Northern Triangle countries and to some extent in Mexico and the other countries. I mean, look at Haiti. In Haiti, there are easy access to guns. And now we have almost the equivalent of Somalia in Haiti because we flooded the country with guns. And
Right.
so that's what creates some of these people coming here. You got to look at the root causes. I mean, you can't say that somebody coming from Haiti today doesn't have a justifiable concern about their safety and their life. Now, does that meet the standard of asylum? Actually, in many cases, it doesn't. But you have to be able to distinguish between three real groups. One, as you point out, people who abuse the system. Two, people who are really fleeing horrible conditions but may not qualify for asylum because the standard in asylum is a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, national origin, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And the whole fight, actually, for your listeners to understand this, often is over the category of what is a member of a particular social group. I'm a person who lives in Guatemala. They're trying to recruit my child to be part of a gang, and they're threatening to kill me and my family. Does that constitute being part of a particular social group or not? That's from a legal point of view, that's what the fight is really over. Because race, religion, national origin, and most of the time political opinion is pretty clear. Somebody, like in Venezuela, somebody who's running for office and the Maduro government is going after them, that person clearly has a claim for asylum. But, the other cases are a little more ambiguous. People who are subject to domestic violence, where the government refuses to do anything about domestic violence. Are they a particular social group or not? And I think one of the things you're going to see in the next administration as an attempt to totally cut off particular social groups. So I think, that's one of the things you want to look for as to what they're going to do as a way of trying to stop asylum in the United States.
Got it. So you brought up all this brings up a question that I've tried to figure out the answer to, because to me, obviously every country has the right to protect its borders. You don't have a country without borders. However, in our particular case, we keep hearing about Biden opened up the border and we have an open and absolutely porous border. What is an open border? What is a closed border? What is that? What are people actually talking about?
Well, first of all, we've always had an open border, and I would invite your listeners to listen to the debate between President Reagan and George H.W. Bush when they were both running for president.
Reagan was very
They
pro,
were
was
so
always
far
pro
left
immigration.
that you couldn't believe it. Reagan was saying they're our neighbors. Of course, we do trade with people. We need to keep the borders open so people can come back and forth. And George H.W. Bush was kind of right behind him, not very different in his approach. And so when you say open borders, we've always had open borders with Mexico. I mean, in other words, people come across every day. People work in Mexico from the United States. Mexicans work in the United States. So in some sense, we've always had that open border. What they're really talking about is enforcement and how you enforce the border for people who aren't just normally coming across or don't have like a border crossing card or a document that allows them. When there's mass of people coming, no one has ever said, ever that I know of, even the people who are most pro-immigration, no one has ever said everybody can just come into the United States. And that's what, when the people who support the next president, they talk about open borders, it's just a fictitious view. No one has ever said, just let everybody come in who wants to come in. What they've said is you have to have a system, and that's what I was talking about before. Biden did the three things that were needed to be done, but never did it too late and never did the fourth thing. The three things are, how you change the conditions in the countries. That is what's pushing people, what we call push factors. What are pushing people to come to the United States? Number two, how you treat people at the border, how you make these determinations as to whether or not they should come in or not, and how you keep the border regulated, in terms of who can come in, who can't come in, and what the circumstances are, and how you treat asylees when people say the magic words, I'm afraid to go back to my country. I want to stay in the United States because I'll be killed if I go back. Somebody makes that's a serious claim because you're talking about a death sentence. So you have to figure out which ones are real and which ones aren't real. But the fourth part that they really did, in my view, and Tony and I have talked about this a lot, is that they totally failed to distribute people through the United States. In other words, we in the United States can easily take 2 million people. I mean, people are shocked at that. But the reality is we're a huge country, and a huge country that needs people in different places. That's why when everything happened in Springfield, Ohio, and the president-elect and his vice president were making ridiculous claims, the people of Springfield didn't say that, because the people of Springfield know that those people who were coming into their community, the Haitians, contributed to their economy. And there's small towns and small cities all over the United States that benefit from immigrants coming in there. And to show you why this is true, the Congressional Budget Office did a study in February. And the Congressional Budget Office is neutral. It's not Republican, it's not Trumper, it's not MAGA, it's not Democrats. They said in the next 10 years, those people who came into the United States over the last 3 or 4 years would do two things. Number one, they would increase the GDP by $9 trillion, not million, not billion, $9 trillion, and they would reduce the deficit by almost $1 trillion because it's economic activity. You're sending people to places where they need people. And that makes the difference in the economic activity. Why do you think Japan has stagflation for years? Why do you think they've had problems in their economy? They can't integrate immigrants into their economy. So I don't think they did a good job of that. I think, ironically, Governor Abbott in Texas and Governor DeSantis in Florida, by sending people, had they done it in a humane way, had they notified the other places where they were sending people, except instead of making a political point, we're doing the right thing. We should have had a system where if we can't determine the outcome of somebody's fate at the border, then we should have a system of allowing them to come in temporarily at least. And at the end, in the last 6 months, that's what Biden started to do, but it was too little and too late. And in other words, people wound up all in New York, or they wound up all in Chicago, when they should have wound up in a small city in Illinois and a small city in upstate New York. But one problem was many of those places, quite honestly, are governed by Republican small town mayors and so forth, and they refuse to take the people. So there's a political component there too.
And by the way, if I can add something to that, Ira, that playbook was put into practice during the 1960s when the Cuban diaspora made their way here. First and foremost, you were looking to reunite with family, and if that wasn't an option, they would provide you with a couple of different options. I have friends of mine that wound up in the Midwest, others that were part of the group of Cubans that went out to California. We went to New Jersey. So when people think of the Cuban diaspora as being very Miami-centric, it really isn't. It really isn't. And, if you know anything about immigrants, all they're really looking for is an opportunity to improve their lot in life.
Right.
And if that means going up to Detroit, Michigan and shoveling snow and being part of the automotive industry, hallelujah, they'll be a part of it. No, yeah.
Yeah.
And just another thing I wanted to add to your earlier point. Not only are we a large enough society that we can absorb 2 million immigrants, but we also have a very large portion of our population that's rapidly aging, which sort of mirrors the reality that we've seen in Japan, right? We've seen Japan's reluctance to bring in immigrants, and yet they've got this very large aging population and not enough of a youthful population to support that group. So when we're faced with the same thing here, no different, I guess, than any other natural resource. If you don't have enough of it here, you import. In this case, we should be importing human capital.
Right. Absolutely. And even if you look at China, remember China had the one child policy. They turned around and realized they're having this aging population. And since it's not likely that they're going to have lots of immigrants come in like we do, because, people look at the United States as the beacon of freedom and they are willing to come here and, make their lives here. A place like China, they may not be so willing to do it. They had to end their one child policy because of the aging population. That's absolutely right. And Tony, what you're saying about Cubans, I mean, I know people who became professors in Arkansas and Indiana and places like that. They just went to different cities.
Yeah. And it with anything else, if you don't have enough of it, you can ramp up production, right? We're suddenly going to war. We don't have enough, a specific type of item that we would need. We can ramp up production the way we did in World War II. You can't make 18-year-olds, right? They were, they were either put into production, 18 and a half years ago, or you just don't have enough of them right now. And we're facing that reality. And it just really, I think it really worries me to see that and I've seen it, right? I've seen it in our own, in my own home, for example. We had a housekeeper who was here without the proper documentation. And during Trump's first term, she had a sister that was living in Canada. And she was concerned. She was very concerned for her safety. And her sister encouraged her to migrate to Canada. And she did. And she's now a Canadian citizen and she has access to healthcare. And her child is a senior in college. And it just pained me to see that, the American dream was continuing on a trek further north and that she was given an opportunity there that was no longer available to her here.
That's right.
Yep. I do want to, again, before we get into the next point, which I will need your help with, Ira, is the facts need to be stated, I think, and they're just not out there enough. But 18.6% of the entire U.S. labor force is made up of both legal and illegal immigrants. The labor force participation of the foreign-born, right, whether they be legal or illegal, is 66.6%. So the vast majority are employed and working in the U.S. economy, and that's actually 5% higher than the native-born.
Okay.
If 8.3 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S., that is, that's one of the numbers that is expressed out there, all the way up to 11, 12 million. But immigrants overall paid $383 billion in federal taxes and $200 billion in state and local taxes just in 2022. And undocumented immigrants paid $60 billion in federal taxes and $14 billion in state and local taxes. And they also paid $25.7 billion into Social Security. If they never get documented, if they stay here illegally forever, that's not money they have any way to ever get access to, based on their contribution. So I think it's beyond, I think, debate at this point, though some will, that immigrants, and let's just stay on illegal immigrants, have a net negative effect on the U.S. economy. And that has just been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt to be untrue. Does that justify people coming to our borders, entering, sneaking in, overstaying their visas? Does that justify their place here in America? No, not necessarily. But, I want to quote our president-elect. On day one of my presidency, they're getting out and getting out fast. That was not a month ago or 2 months ago. That was in August of 2015. He won that election, took office, and promised that mass deportations were going to happen on day one. He's promised that again. However, in his first term, he really didn't do the mass deportation thing, right? So where I need your help, Ira, is explain to me, what does mass deportation actually mean? Because I think it's a great political strategy term, right? Mass deportation sounds very shock and awe, and I'm gonna, make that change. And he has all the power in the world now. So, in speaking to my beloved uh, friends, even on the very far right, they're like, "Oh yeah, That's why we voted for him. We want to see that."
Yeah.
What does mass deportations actually mean? Is there a number associated with that? What's the KPI? And what's that process going to look like or not going to look like?
Well, the first thing is how many people are here who are subject to deportation? And obviously, no one has a very, very good handle on that. Trump started and said it's 2 million, then he said 10 million, then he said 20 million. It's all a kind of political show. And I think, as you pointed out before, despite all his rhetoric the first term, he actually deported less people than President Obama did in his term, his 2 terms, and even President Biden has deported in the last 4 years. So the reality is more to the point that it's a very complex situation, even trying to deport people. It's not where you just round up people and you deport them, because if they're in the United States and they don't have a final order of deportation, then they're entitled to have a hearing. And they've always been entitled to have a hearing. And why do we do that? Because it's quite possible, and in my years of experience practicing law, it happens that they pick up American citizens. And sometimes you're arguing to the court, you can't deport this person because they're an American citizen, or they're a resident,
Well,
or they're actually here legally.
that was a huge consequence, and even Donald Trump referenced the Operation Wetback from the Eisenhower administration, where yes, indeed, a number of actual U.S. citizens were rounded up in that act.
That's right. And so how would one do a mass deportation? The answer is they can't. He won't. What he'll do is what he's very good at, which is to put on a political show, to do a kind of shock and awe, do like a campaign of terror, round up 100,000 people, put them in camps, and make it seem like they're deporting millions, but they're not going to be able to deport millions of people for a whole host of reasons. I mean, they say, well, we're going to deport these people because they're criminals and so forth. Every president, in my experience in all these years, has always said the same thing. We're going to go after the criminals first. And actually, Obama did that in his administration. They actually went after the people who had committed crimes. But then the question becomes, if you really look at most of the crimes, what do you see? We're not talking about the 1 in 10 million who killed somebody, like this Venezuelan kid who came in illegally. It's outrageous. It's shocking. Nobody would ever condone anything like that. But many of the people who are, quote, even felons, for example, what is a third-degree felony in Florida? If you drive without a license. If you lie on your application for a license, it could be a third-degree felony. So now we're talking about, we're deporting felons. And why are they a felon? Because they couldn't get a license legally because the state wouldn't give them any form of identification. So, who are we really talking about? And for the most part, these are the people we're talking about. We're talking about people who what we call low-hanging fruit. There are people who already have final orders of deportation. There's over 150,000 Cubans in South Florida alone who have final orders of deportation that extend back 40 years. I want to see if Trump's going to deport them or not.
So no, so
Given
that's
the politics.
that's a fascinating point. I'm sorry, 150,000 final orders of deportation, meaning we're going to deport you. We just haven't.
Yeah, well, they couldn't deport them because Cuba would not take them back. And then Cuba finally made some kind of agreement with the United States to take some people back, but they're only taking very few back at the present time. So what is Trump going to do? What is he going to do? Drop them in the sea? He's not going to do anything to them. And he's not going to do it politically or otherwise because of the support he's received in the Cuban community. And if he tries to do it, it's going to be interesting politically what happens. So that's, that's a good example of what you do with people. But many of these kind of low-hanging fruit people, who are they? They're people who may have had a conviction 30 years ago, just remained in the United States because we were not that aggressive about physically removing people, but they have final orders of deportation. They've never had another problem. They've led exemplary lives all these times. Those are the people who are going to get picked up first. So you're talking about, or people who have real hardship. In other words, we have a process that we call deferred action. Deferred action means, I'm in the United States illegally. I have a child, and I have a case like this, and most immigration lawyers do. I have a child who has a disease that is so rare that they want to have the child stay here and give the child whatever treatment they can, that there's no other place literally in the world that can treat that child meaningfully. And so they give them deferred action while the child's trying to recover. Those are people who have final orders of deportation. They can pick them up tomorrow, but you got to be a pretty inhumane human being to do that. But those are the people who, when they talk about, we're going to deport people. Then there's a separate group, the people who, as you were pointing out, Victor, the people who work in home health care, the people who pick the crops of America, the people who do the meat packing in the United States.
50% of the construction
The
labor force in
construction-
Texas is undocumented.
Yeah, we were talking about it the other day. If they go here in South Florida and really go and do their shock and awe and start to pick up all those people, all construction will stop in South Florida. All of it.
So
I mean, any meaningful
this would be any meaningful en masse deportation.
Right.
Talk about hyperinflationary. I mean, we are already short on labor in a number of different industries. So if we take, that 5% of the labor force and deport them overnight, I mean, that immediately throws us into a deep, dark recession. Am I right?
Well, and to put into context, everything I've read, if in fact they do put in place these mass deportations, the decrease in our national GDP will exceed that of the 2007 and 2009 Great Recession by almost 2 to 1. So if we thought that was a tough pill to swallow, this will be just an enormous self-inflicted gun wound.
And I absolutely, and I recently read that it was based on a general number, but it would cost in the billions on a yearly basis, not to actually deport them, but because, okay, let's say they do roundups, right? They go to workplaces and they round up all these illegal immigrants. Well, where are you going to put them? Where are you going to detain them? Where are they going to wait to give them their due process of law procedures? Well, prisons, maybe.
Well, they're
military bases,
they're already talking about building
yes,
holding centers.
Holding centers. And so that brings me to my point, because even just last night, the president-elect very clearly said, yes, he's willing to engage the military to do something. Exactly what? I'm still not sure. There's no details behind it. But Ira, in that case, what sort of legal barriers would he have to overcome in order to, or does he, to engage the military and actually going and gathering these people and then detaining them, deporting them?
Well, he's got a number of, I think, tools. Let's put it that way to do it. First of all, there's a section of the law 212F. That's the one they used to ban the Muslims many years ago. So he may put in another Muslim ban in effect under section 212F. Then there is what he keeps talking about with the Alien Enemies Act. I don't think they can really use the Alien Enemies Act. The Alien Enemies Act is meant for if we're at war, or there's an invasion, or there's something that looks like an invasion by a foreign country. In other words, it has to be directed by a foreign country. So all the talk about the Alien Enemies Act, I think, is going to be challenged if he tries to use that as a basis of rounding up people. But you can imagine different scenarios. I mean, he can say, we've had a war on terrorism since 2001, which is true. And therefore, we can pick up people because we think this is an invasion and it's terrorism and so forth. I assume he's banking on, the Federalist judges to support him in whatever he does. But the reality is, I don't think the Alien Enemies Act is a particularly strong basis to try and do it. And then there is a section of the Immigration Act, 103A10, which says the Attorney General, if there's a mass influx of people. But right now, actually, there isn't a mass influx of people because Biden has shut down the border as a practical matter, and you're just having people come over in relatively small numbers. So they could use that provision. And if Matt Gaetz is as Attorney General, I'm sure that they will try and use that provision to say we can round up people. And what that provision says, in effect, is that they can deputize state and local officials, sheriffs, marshals, the Texas Rangers, whatever it is, to go out and pick up people and detain them.
Well, it would require, it's been stated everywhere that it would require the cooperation of the state and local government. So this effort could look very different in red states versus blue states, if there are any of those left, actually, maybe California. But it does. So let me dig into that. Let's say Governor Newsom, that there's this mass deportation effort. As the governor of a state with its own power to implement federal, in this particular case, does a local state government have the ability to not follow along with that or not contribute to that effort?
Well, I think that's exactly the right question to ask, and that exactly is what will happen. The states are gearing up. The blue states are gearing up for that fight, and I think it's a mixed bag. It depends on what they're going to do. The statute that I just quoted says that it must be approved by the officials of that state. But my view is, since this is all a political stunt, Trump would love that. In other words, he, in order to make inroads in the blue states, he wants them to say we're not cooperating, to get more people upset in those states. He obviously knows the red states are going to cooperate because they've been doing it on their own anyway, right? I mean, Florida and Texas and some of the other states. So, but could they fight it? Yes, I believe they could fight it. Let me tell you, just to put this in perspective for your listeners, there's been a study done as to what this will cost. And this is going to cost about $340 billion to try and do what Trump claims he's going to do. And I think he recently said, Victor, as you may have pointed out, that he doesn't care about the cost. Let me tell you what $340 billion could do in America. It could build 40,450 new elementary schools, 2.9 million homes, funds for the Head Start program for nearly 79 years from now, full tuition paid for kids in public schools for 4 years. I mean, so we're going to spend all this amount of money, and they're not going to deport in the end, I believe, more than 800,000 people if they're lucky, and it's going to be over more than 1 million people, more than he deported the last time. Because if you round up all these people, as you pointed out, they're entitled to hearings. So first there's going to be lawsuits that are going to say you had no authority to round them up. Then each of those people who are rounded up, unless they are this low-hanging fruit, which is not that many people, the rest of the people are overstays of one way or another. They're going to have claims. You know, if they've been here 10 years, there's a claim for what we call cancellation of removal, that it's going to be extreme hardship to their family members, so who are American citizens. So they have a claim. They may have a claim for asylum. Who knows? But if they get mired into doing those deportation hearings, those hearings are going to take years. You know, I have cases right now with very strong claims for political asylum. You can't get a hearing until 2027. Trump's legacy in his last administration was to have over 1 million people in removal proceedings. And now we're going to add another 1 million to those? You're talking about hearings in 2030. Now, he can say, I'm going to pick them all up and just kick them out, but he can't do that consistent with the statute unless the people already have final orders. So he can pick up people with final orders, but those 11 million are not mostly people with final orders of deportation. They're mostly people who just stayed because they didn't want to leave to become a resident and wait 10 years out of the country. So I think all of this, it's just another, typical Trump stunt. They are going to terrorize a lot of people. They're going to go into factories. They're going to go into, restaurants or go into hotels, and they're going to do it very symbolically. They're going to make a lot of noise. They're going to say, see, we're doing this. And at some point, the business community is going to tell them, you got to be kidding. If you keep doing this in agriculture, we're not going to have food in the United States. Okay.
So that is a great point that I have had numerous cigar shop debates over. And look, I know on the street where my favorite cigar shop is, tons of restaurants. I know 30 illegal immigrants, right? If we want, identifying them is not really, it can't possibly be that difficult to identify them. Now, my question is, and tell me, and perhaps I'm wrong and this is hyperbolic, but I feel that we are all complicit in the crime, because when I go to Costco and spend $300 and buy 3 pounds of tomatoes, I get them at a certain price because, let's be honest, who's picking those things, right? When I buy a home in Frisco, Texas, that was not built paying construction workers American level wages and benefits. And also, these people, if they are so employable and they're all employed, what is the role of the business owner in having employed an undocumented worker? Because, and I'm looking for a little more education on this, because in speaking to a number of different business owners, some say it's really just a little piece of paperwork. Nobody cares. Nobody follows up. I get that piece of paper, throw it in a drawer. You never hear about it again. And others say, well, yeah, I openly hired them because that's it. I can't run this office cleaning business. There is no anyone who's going to do this. Is the business owner on the hook for anything in this?
Well,
situation.
you really raise a wonderful question there, Vic, and there's another element to this which is pretty widespread, and that's organizations that no longer do the hiring themselves. They distance themselves from it by hiring a staffing company. So if all of a sudden they find out that, oh, you've got, 4 undocumented workers in your, insert corporate logo here. Oh, that wasn't us. We use the staffing
So
company,
the
and we no longer
liability is
use
placed on the
we'll use
staffing
something else.
company.
That's just all part of the hypocrisy. And you're seeing that on a very large scale with very large American companies from coast to coast.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, Tony. I mean, you're absolutely right. And, what does an employer have to do? You were asking, Victor. The employer just has to look, the person has to fill out a form called an I-9, which is what everyone has to fill out who works now. And they have to see if they have a social security card and a driver's license. Or some other, they have a green card or they have a US passport or whatever it is. There are certain documents for employment and identity. And if those documents facially appear okay, the employer is off the hook. That's the safe harbor for the employer. So, if somebody comes with a social security card that's on 8.5 by 11 paper, then obviously it's not facially valid. But
Right.
if they come with a social security card and it may not be theirs or it may be a phony card, then the employer is off the hook. The real problem, though, that you're pointing to is a serious problem. And I think a lot of the people are angry who are not making enough money. But this, to me, is the class. It's like racism in the South, it's like Jim Crow in the South. It's like instead of blaming it on the right people, who are the people depressing wages? The fact that Republicans in Congress, for example, have not voted for the minimum wage for the last 20 years. You don't have a minimum wage at $15 an hour in America. You want to blame people? Let's blame the right people. Don't blame the immigrants. The thing about Trump is people are disgruntled, and his solution was blame the immigrants.
Yeah, and that's been an absolute playbook over history. Sure,
Yeah.
it's a great political strategy. Sure, I
Right.
mean, I've always, sadly, what I think few people are trying to acknowledge is that, okay, if you're a native-born middle-class American and you can't get a job, and you're losing your job to an undocumented, not even elementary school educated, illiterate, who doesn't speak the language, if they're taking your job, your problem isn't the guy who crossed the border and took your job. The problem is you. And when I say you, it's us as a country. We are not preparing our country to compete on a global scale. And this is not just in the lower skilled jobs, but this is in general, which brings me to my next point. And yeah, you know what? The fact is that uh, Trump employed a great political strategy, but what I do have an issue with is I criticize both sides on for where we are today because yeah, the Democrats, they threw up that proposal at the end of last year in bipartisan. It was shot down, by candidate Trump at the point. But this is not, the immigration problem is not 5 years old or 10 years old. It is decades upon decades old. And maybe I hate to be such a cynic, but from this perspective, I feel like we as Americans are all getting played in the sense that it's a political football. Let's blame these people, and then there's these pawns that are just in the middle, in the middle of existence, in the shadows of existence, and we're just throwing that back and forth. So, when we speak of actual immigration reform, what are the 2-3 things that we at some point, hopefully in our history, can do to really take control of this thing and make it beneficial for all?
No, I think that is the question. And that's the question that, they haven't been able to address in Congress for many years because of what you're saying. In 1986, Ronald Reagan granted the amnesty. And the flip side, to answer your question, was employer sanctions. In other words, we recognize that there are people in the country, they're contributing to the country, but let's not give them the future people, let's not give the employer the ability to attract people who are not authorized to work and so forth. And so the idea was, on the one hand, you give amnesty, on the other, you give employer sanctions. The people who are here are going to be here no matter what. And I think we need to recognize that as a political reality. I don't agree that they're taking jobs away from American citizens. That's the thing that bothered me the most about what happened in the last 6 months, which is there are times in American history when they were competing for jobs. But the reality is we had 6 million, and today I think we still have 6 million unfulfilled jobs. Many of the jobs, although not all, but many of the jobs that immigrants take are jobs that Americans don't do. They're jobs that are, working in the fields, working in meatpacking and so forth. But if you want to address the issue, we should be addressing it economically, which means we should be giving Americans real wages. Given the circumstances that we're in now, we should be talking about raising the minimum wage to a substantial amount of money, even above the $15 an hour, so people can really have some kind of not living paycheck to paycheck, but really have a real job where they can sustain themselves. In terms of immigration, I think we do have to have an orderly process at the border, and they do have to do something. But I personally believe that the way to do that is not to keep giving more and more and more money to what I now call the immigration industrial complex, which is what we're doing. When I started practicing immigration law, I think Border Patrol and the others got about 20 million, $30 million. They're up to $6 to $9 billion now and saying they don't have enough money to handle this. It's not a matter of putting more machinery, more officers, more everything else at the border. It's a matter of how you handle people and where you distribute them and what you do. So from an economic point of view, we need to be much more sophisticated about where we need people. And if people are coming, how we decide where they go, if we're letting them in. If we're not letting them in because they're criminals or they're inadmissible and so forth, we should have a very strong enforcement policy with respect to them. But we need to recognize that the people who are here are going to stay here no matter what, and they can play, kind of a political football with this as long as they want. But that's not going to change people's lives. Getting rid of these people, as we discussed before, is just going to make things worse. It's going to raise the prices. It may create, some kind of drastic drop in the GDP. But it is a complicated question. You're absolutely right, because it's, you have to think about everything you do may affect prices, right? I mean, you cut back on immigration, the prices are going to go up on things. It's just that simple. So we have to have a system that recognizes we're going into, more skilled areas, bringing in more skilled people that we may need who aren't competing with Americans, bringing in very low skilled people who aren't competing with Americans, and, giving Americans the opportunity to expand the economy. And that means, I think, what the administration was trying to do with the IRA, getting good jobs, green jobs, union jobs, and so forth. But it's all a package with immigration. You are always going to have immigration. You need to make sure that that immigration is beneficial. And I think this is where you were going, which is beneficial to the American people. I mean, other than not forcing people to go back, we don't have an obligation to take everybody in the world. We have an obligation to take people that are going to help America. And so I think looking at each of the categories in a very detailed way with respect to skilled labor, with respect to unskilled labor, and trying to figure out, what's beneficial. And the other aspect is family reunification, which has always been a central part of our immigration system. In other words, it's not just economics, it's allowing you to bring in your close family. What I was saying before about brothers and sisters, those categories are so backlogged. There's always a lot of talk about why even have them. Let's use those visas for something else. But we need to create more visas to allow people so they don't come to the border. That if they have a child, a son or daughter who's 20 years old or 21, and their parent here is a resident, they shouldn't have to wait 8 years outside of the United States to come in. So,
Right.
and that's a function of how many visas we have.
So how many visas? But then isn't there such an enormous backlog, and don't we need more judges? And how quickly is that
Right.
implemented?
I mean, the point is, with the backlog that we have with respect to the people who are here, we're never going to be able to deport all of those people. So, yes, you can have more judges, you can make more determinations. You need to make it clear that if you have a final order of deportation, you're going to be deported, and you want to enforce that law
Yeah.
as long as the people have had the process that they're entitled to. I think everybody believes that. Even even the
Yeah.
most pro-immigration advocates say, if you're here illegally and you've had your day in court and you've lost the case, and there's no unusual circumstance, like you may have a very sick child or something, those people should be deported. But they shouldn't be deported 20 years later, which is what we're talking about now. All that low-hanging fruit that we were talking about before, those are people who've been here for years and years and years. And that's why Reagan recognized we needed an amnesty. It's not fair to people who have been here for years and we didn't do anything. And we have provisions in the law to deal with it. We have something called registry. If you've been here before a certain date, you become a resident, unless you're a bad person, unless you lack good moral character. So registry says if you came here before 1972, you can become a resident of the United States. We can move the simplest way to deal with all this, honestly, is to move the registry date up to 2022 or 2024. And then you cover everybody by registry. And if they're a person who's a person of good moral character, they get to stay. If they're not, they're deported.
Got it.
And Ira, would you say part of a new look at our immigration system, would it make sense to revisit the old Bracero program, which, if you recall, allowed people, particularly from Latin America, to come to the U.S., work, the fields during the season, and then they were free to go back home and come back once the season started again. Would
Right.
that sort of project make sense?
We have that now. We have the H-2A and the H-2B programs. The problem is they're so mired down in, details,
Right.
and it takes, a long time for people to come in, and they have different interpretations under the law. I'm not going to, bore everybody with the interpretations, but yeah, I mean, in other words, to the extent that we need what they call seasonal labor,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Somebody works in a ski resort for 4 months a year, right?
Or even in America's farmland, right? That's
Or
one industry that we know will be very, very affected by mass deportations. And
but
just
the employer,
anecdotally, I'm
yeah,
sorry, anecdotally, I've interviewed, some folks who had worked that Bracero program, and once they did away with the program, it sort of forced them to stay, because if they went back home to Latin America, they wouldn't have a chance of coming back in. So by doing away with the program, it sort of exacerbated the problem.
yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think we can have that program, but the employers also have to take responsibility, because one of the ways that these programs break down is that the conditions in which they're keeping people are inhumane. So the Department of Labor should be saying, and they have, certainly in the last 4 years, have been saying, you have to have these standards. You have to give people, here in Florida, the governor, as you know, fought the proposition that people shouldn't have a break in the middle of 90-degree heat during the day, when they were trying to say, let's have a law that says you get a break, right? I mean, you get a water break for 5 minutes, several times a day. They were saying, no, it shouldn't be mandated by law. So if you treat people humanely and you put some, I think, requirements on the employer, yeah, we could have a massive H-2A program, and the people go back. And if they don't go back, they get deported. That's right.
Yeah,
And the same thing with H-2Bs, which has to do with, cutting the lawns at Mar-a-Lago and other places.
which, by the way, I shouldn't say most immigrants that I have interviewed, aside from those like myself that come from from a communist country, let's say, the dreams and aspirations are to come here, make enough money to go back to Santo Domingo, go back to Mexico, buy a home and live comfortably. For the majority of Latino immigrants, it wasn't let's come and we're going to stay. I think the ultimate would be to go back. And I think that program can help alleviate some of those concerns. Yeah.
And I think the other, I think, nuance of that is we have to help to create the conditions in those countries where people are not fleeing. I mean, I think it's a little different from Mexicans versus people in the Northern Triangle countries, or a country like Haiti, which is a total, it's a frightful place to live in under certain circumstances for people. And, is it our responsibility to deal with it? Maybe not. But from a practical point of view, we'd certainly be a lot more intelligent to deal with it. And then instead of worrying about these people coming in, we spend a lot less money helping these countries than we do defending the border when they all start fleeing. So,
and we have to acknowledge our role in sort of our interventionist policies, both from a diplomatic but also an economic standpoint that contribute to the demand to come. I mean, and that's sadly, I'm not sure that we are in a place where we can even have that discussion, because even trying to get down to learning history is almost unpatriotic, and acknowledging that the history and facts is unpatriotic. But go ahead.
Vic, if I can add something to that, I think it also needs to be framed in sort of a self-serving manner, right? There's such turmoil in our region. Do we really want, which by the way has happened throughout the world, there's no reason why it can't happen here. Do we really want China to be the one that fixes Cuba's grid and provides everybody with electricity and helps solve the problem in Haiti? And all of a sudden we're forced with that situation, right? We can wake up to that one morning very, very quickly. And I don't think anyone would want to face that reality, when in fact it's something that we can step in. And again, it's not to fix the problems of the rest of the world, but very self-serving for our own interests.
Right.
How do we help our neighbors sort of, maintain their lawns and paint their homes to prevent the entire neighborhood from decaying?
Yeah. Okay. I can't tell you, Tony, it's not kind of a low bar, but I feel so much smarter on this topic. And I want to continue learning. And, one of the things that a big thing coming out of this last election that I have really wanted to do is really seek out more information, learn more about these issues and topics. But I want to take it out of the hands of simple political propaganda. For anyone who is listening to this, if I want to learn more about the immigration issue in all of its facets and all of its nuances and complexities, what do you recommend as good, unbiased, just fact resources where one could go in and study?
I would take a look at the American Immigration Council because they do a lot of studies on immigration issues. And I think, and it's all fact based. So I would take a look at that. If you don't want to go to sleep, you could get my book, but my book's really more of a technical book. I mean, if somebody wanted to read through the technical aspects of immigration, the book is pretty comprehensive,
I
which is
will.
why the lawyers use it. But in terms of studies and understanding the issues, I think the American Immigration Council does a wonderful job of addressing a number of these issues. And there's a lot of independent, the Congressional Budget Office does studies, the federal government does studies. And I would look at those, I mean, even some of the things that we do, if you wanted to look at it, it's immigrants list, but it does come from a particular, very pro-immigration perspective. But I think if you wanted just things that were kind of more neutral, I would look at the Immigration Council. I would look at there are some books like the American Immigration Lawyers Association puts out kind of a book that's less technical. It's a small book in regard to immigration in general, and you may want to suggest that to your listeners. So if you wanted to get kind of an overview, that's a good book to get as well.
Great.
If I can add an invaluable resource to that list, it would be One Quarter of the Nation, Immigration and the Transformation of America. I believe it was written by Nancy Foner. Will give you a real solid historical perspective on immigration. Some of the anecdotes that Ira alluded to earlier, right? The impact of the Irish and the Italians and the Jews and so forth. It is who we are as a nation. There is nothing as quintessentially American as the immigrant experience. It always has been. I can only hope that it will continue to be. But beyond the rhetoric, I think that particular book will give you a pretty good handle on the role that immigration, the outsized role, I would say, that immigrants have played in the American experiment.
Wonderful. Again, thank you guys both so much for your time today. I feel like I've learned so much, and the greatest product of I think of a good conversation is you walk away wanting to learn even more, and that's exactly how I feel today, and it's exactly what this little show is about. So honestly, thank you both for your time.
Thank you, Victor.
Thanks, Vic.
Thanks,
It was a
Tony.
lot of fun.
Good to see you.